Emily Carter pulled into the glittering gala parking lot in a 10-year-old Honda, and the laughter started before she even stepped out. Jason Walker, her ex-husband, leaned against a black Mercedes and smirked. "Still driving that cheap thing, Em? Did the divorce hit you that hard?" His friends laughed. Emily said nothing, just tightened her grip on the worn car keys. Then the sky thundered. Heads turned as a sleek private jet roared low overhead toward the nearby runway. Moments later, black SUVs rolled into the lot. A tall man stepped out, scanning the crowd until his eyes landed on Emily. Jason's smile faded when the billionaire walked straight toward her and said quietly, "Your jet is ready." Sometimes the loudest laugh in the room is the one that ages the worst. The parking lot outside the Grand Meridian Hotel shimmered under rows of golden lights as luxury sedans rolled in one after another, engines purring softly, valets in black jackets moving with practiced efficiency. Emily Carter's car did not purr. It rattled once before settling into silence, the tired engine of her 10-year-old silver Honda finally giving up its short climb into the crowded lot. She sat there for a moment with both hands on the steering wheel, feeling the faint vibration fade beneath her palms. Around her, polished doors opened and expensive shoes touched pavement, the low murmur of confident conversations floating through the warm evening air. She could already hear the gala inside through the glass lobby doors 50 yards away. Music, laughter, the hum of a room full of people who had never worried about the price of gas or the age of their car. Emily took a slow breath and reached for her purse. The leather was worn but clean, just like the car. Just like the quiet life, she had rebuilt piece by careful piece after everything fell apart. When she opened the door, the sound of her engine shutting off seemed louder than it should have been. Heads turned. Not many, but enough. And then came the voice she knew better than her own heartbeat. "Well, I'll be damned." Jason Walker leaned casually against a black Mercedes 2 rows over, one arm draped over the roof like he owned the entire lot. His charcoal suit fit perfectly, his watch gleamed under the lights, and the familiar crooked smile curved across his face as if the last 3 years had been nothing more than a long lunch break. "Emily Carter," he said louder, making sure the small circle of investors and socialites around him heard every word. "You're still driving that thing?" A few people chuckled politely. Jason pushed off the Mercedes and walked a few steps closer, his gaze sliding slowly over the Honda like it was an exhibit in a museum of poor decisions. "That car's got to be pushing, 180,000 miles, he said with a laugh. "Didn't the divorce settlement cover at least a used upgrade?" The laughter came easier this time, a ripple through the group. Emily felt the familiar weight of their eyes, the quiet judgment that always seemed to follow moments like this. But her fingers simply tightened around the worn metal of her car keys. She closed the door gently behind her. "It still runs," she said calmly. Jason let out a louder laugh, clapping once as if she had delivered a punchline. "That's the spirit," he said, shaking his head with theatrical sympathy. Hi, Em." The words floated across the lot, but Emily was already turning toward the entrance. The warm evening air carried the scent of expensive cologne and fresh pavement after a long day of summer heat. Somewhere above the city lights, a distant rumble rolled through the sky. At first it sounded like thunder, but thunder didn't move that fast. Conversation slowed. A few people looked up. The sound grew louder, deeper, the unmistakable roar of engines cutting through the night air. A sleek private jet passed low overhead, its silver body catching the glow of the city before angling toward the nearby executive runway, less than a mile away. The entire parking lot paused for a moment, heads tilted upward, the sound echoing between buildings before fading into the distance. Jason glanced up too, impressed despite himself. "Now that," he said with a whistle, "is how you arrive somewhere." But Emily had already noticed something else. Down the street, turning slowly into the hotel entrance, came 3 identical black SUVs with dark tinted windows. And for reasons she couldn't quite explain, they were heading straight toward her. The 3 black SUVs rolled slowly into the entrance of the Grand Meridian Hotel like a quiet storm arriving, without warning, their polished surfaces, reflecting the gold glow of the overhead lights. Conversations in the parking lot softened as people instinctively stepped aside, the subtle choreography of wealth and curiosity unfolding without a single word being spoken. Emily Carter stood beside her aging silver Honda, the cool metal of the key pressing gently into her palm, watching the vehicles glide past rows of luxury sedans and polished sports cars. The rumble of the private jet was still fading from the sky, but the presence of the convoy pulled every eye back down to earth. Jason Walker followed the movement too, his amusement momentarily interrupted as he straightened his posture and adjusted the cuff of his tailored jacket. The investors beside him leaned closer, whispering guesses about who might be arriving. In places like this, a convoy like that usually meant someone powerful, someone worth knowing, someone whose handshake could change the direction of an entire company. The first SUV came to a smooth stop near the front entrance where the valets usually receive their most important guests. The second stopped directly behind it. The third remained idling for a moment longer before easing to a halt near the edge of the lot, not far from where Emily stood. The engine hummed quietly, a low mechanical heartbeat that seemed strangely loud in the brief silence that had fallen across the lot. Jason gave a short laugh and nudged one of the men beside him. He said that someone big must have decided to attend the gala after all. Perhaps a hedge fund owner. Perhaps a tech founder. Someone joked that it might be the same person who owned the jet that had just passed overhead. The speculation grew quickly, the energy of the moment spreading like electricity through the small crowd. The valet staff moved faster now, straightening jackets, preparing for the kind of arrival that would appear in tomorrow morning's business pages. Emily did not move. She watched the third SUV carefully, her calm expression giving nothing away even as the soft click of a door unlocking reached her ears. Jason noticed where she was looking and shook his head with a smirk, as if the evening had suddenly become even more entertaining. He called out across the distance between them, his voice still light with casual mockery. He said that maybe the jet was here to rescue her from that old Honda. The group around him laughed again, though this time their attention was divided between Jason's joke and the unfolding scene at the front of the lot. The driver of the third SUV stepped out first, tall and composed, scanning the area briefly before opening the rear door with deliberate precision. The interior light flickered on, casting a warm glow onto the pavement. For a moment, no one inside moved. The entire parking lot seemed to lean forward in quiet anticipation. Emily felt the warm evening breeze brush lightly against her face as she lifted her eyes toward the open door. Somewhere inside the hotel the music from the gala swelled faintly through the glass walls, but out here the world had narrowed to the small circle of light spilling from the SUV. Then a polished black shoe touched the pavement, followed by the steady movement of a man stepping out into the glow of the lot. He stood tall, composed, his presence calm but unmistakably commanding, and when he lifted his head his eyes moved across the rows of cars as if searching for someone very specific. The murmurs around Jason faded into silence when the man began walking directly across the lot, not toward the hotel entrance, not toward the crowd of investors, but toward the quiet woman standing beside the oldest car in the entire parking lot. The man walked with calm, deliberate steps across the parking lot, his polished shoes making soft echoes against the pavement as every conversation around him slowly dissolved into silence. The warm light from the hotel entrance followed him for a few seconds before fading behind his tall silhouette, leaving only the glow of the parking lot lamps reflecting off the dark surface of the SUVs. Jason Walker felt the shift before he understood it. The quiet was different now. People were no longer watching the vehicles. They were watching the direction the man was walking. And that direction was not toward the gala doors. It was toward Emily Carter. Jason frowned slightly, folding his arms as if trying to make sense of a joke that had suddenly stopped being funny. The investors beside him murmured again, whispering the name that had begun to circulate through the small crowd. Daniel Hayes. Even among the wealthy circles that gathered at events like this, the name carried weight. A technology billionaire. Owner of one of the fastest-growing aerospace companies in the country. The man whose private jet fleet had recently made headlines in several financial magazines. Jason felt a small ripple of recognition pass through him as he studied the approaching figure. He had seen Daniel Hayes once before across a conference hall in San Francisco 2 years earlier. Men like Jason noticed men like Daniel Hayes because fortunes that large changed industries. They changed markets. They changed the rules of who had power in a room. Jason straightened his jacket slightly as Daniel came closer, preparing the polite professional smile he used whenever someone important walked into his orbit. But Daniel Hayes never even glanced in his direction. His eyes were focused somewhere else entirely. Emily Carter remained beside her silver Honda, her posture calm, her shoulders relaxed as if the entire parking lot had not fallen silent around her. When Daniel finally stopped a few feet away from her, the faint breeze stirred the edge of his dark coat. He gave a small, respectful nod, the kind reserved for someone whose presence mattered. "Emily," he said quietly, his voice steady and warm. "I apologize for the delay. The runway traffic took longer than expected." The words drifted across the lot like a quiet thunderclap. Jason blinked once, the smile on his face freezing halfway into place. The investors beside him exchanged quick, confused glances. Daniel continued speaking, completely unaware, or perhaps completely uninterested in the stunned audience surrounding them. "Your jet is ready whenever you are. The flight crew has already completed the pre-departure checks." Emily looked up at him with the same calm expression she had worn since stepping out of her car. For a moment, she simply studied the familiar aircraft lights blinking faintly in the distant sky beyond the buildings. Then she gave a small nod. "Thank you, Daniel. I appreciate the timing." Jason finally stepped forward a half step, unable to contain the confusion tightening in his chest. "Wait a second," he said with a forced laugh, gesturing toward Emily. "You know her?" Daniel Hayes turned his head slightly then, his calm eyes settling briefly on Jason Walker, as if acknowledging a distant voice in a crowded room. "Of course," he replied simply. Then his attention returned to Emily as naturally as a compass needle finding north. The SUV door behind him opened again, the interior light spilling softly onto the pavement beside Emily's old Honda. Jason stared at the scene unfolding in front of him, the pieces refusing to fit together. The cheap car, the quiet woman he thought he understood, the billionaire standing patiently beside her like a driver awaiting instructions. And suddenly the distant roar of the jet engines over the runway made a different kind of sense. Jason Walker felt the ground beneath the moment shift in a way he could not immediately explain. The quiet confidence he had carried through the entire evening began to thin like mist under morning sunlight. He stared at Emily Carter as if seeing her for the first time, searching her face for some hint that this was all a misunderstanding, some elaborate coincidence that would restore the simple story he had been telling himself about her life after the divorce. But Emily stood exactly the same as she had moments before, one hand resting lightly on the roof of her old silver Honda, the other holding the familiar ring of keys. She looked calm, almost peaceful. Around them, the parking lot had become a silent stage. The small circle of investors who had been laughing only minutes earlier now watched with the cautious stillness of people realizing they might have misunderstood the entire situation. Daniel Hayes remained beside the open SUV door, his posture relaxed but attentive, like a man accustomed to waiting for a decision that only one person in the world could make. Emily glanced once toward the distant skyline, where the blinking lights of the private jet could still be seen moving slowly along the runway. The warm evening air carried the faint scent of jet fuel mixed with summer asphalt. Somewhere inside the hotel the music from the gala continued, unaware that something far more interesting was unfolding outside beneath the parking lot lamps. Jason cleared his throat and forced another short laugh, though this one sounded thinner than the first. He stepped a little closer, trying to reassert the confident rhythm of the conversation. "Emily," he said, spreading his hands as if the entire moment were a harmless misunderstanding, "you never mentioned you had friends in aerospace." His eyes flicked toward Daniel Hayes, calculating quickly, the way businessmen often did when an unexpected opportunity appeared. Daniel Hayes could open doors. Daniel Hayes could reshape a career with a single introduction. Emily studied Jason for a brief moment. The parking lot lights reflected faintly in her eyes, steady and unreadable. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet clarity of someone who no longer needed to raise it. "Jason," she said calmly, "you never asked." The words settled into the air with surprising weight. Daniel Hayes allowed himself the faintest smile, not directed at Jason but at the simple truth of her answer. Behind him the driver stood patiently beside the SUV, holding the door open. Jason looked again at the vehicle, then at the distant runway lights, then back at Emily's old car. The contrast now felt almost surreal. A 10-year-old Honda with a faded bumper sticker. A convoy of black SUVs. A billionaire waiting beside an open door. Jason tried once more to recover his footing. He gestured toward the Honda with a half-amused shrug. So you drove all the way here in that thing while you have a jet waiting a mile away? Emily followed his glance toward the car and gently ran her hand across the roof as if greeting an old friend. It still runs, she said softly. Then she looked back toward the SUV. And tonight it brought me exactly where I needed to be. Daniel Hayes inclined his head slightly, understanding the signal before she even moved. The distant jet engines rumbled again across the night sky, steady and patient. And for the first time since the laughter had started, Jason Walker realized the evening was no longer his story to control. The rumble of the jet engines rolled softly across the night sky again, a steady, distant thunder that seemed to underline the silence spreading through the parking lot. Jason Walker stood motionless for a moment, his earlier confidence fading beneath the weight of something he had not expected to feel tonight. Uncertainty. Around him, the investors who had been laughing with him only minutes earlier now shifted their attention carefully between Emily Carter and Daniel Hayes, the social mathematics of power recalculating itself in real time. Emily watched the subtle change in the air without any sign of satisfaction or triumph. She had seen rooms like this shift before. The moment when people realized they might have misjudged someone. The moment when laughter suddenly became quiet curiosity. She had lived through enough of those moments to recognize the rhythm of them now. Daniel Hayes remained beside the open SUV door with the calm patience of a man who understood that important decisions were rarely rushed. His presence carried the quiet gravity of someone used to controlling billion-dollar schedules, yet there was nothing impatient in the way he waited. Emily took a slow breath of the warm evening air and glanced once more toward the distant runway lights blinking steadily in the darkness. The jet would be fueled and ready. The flight crew would be watching the clock. Yet for a brief moment she remained beside the old car that had carried her through years of rebuilding. Jason shifted his weight and stepped closer, lowering his voice slightly, as if hoping to recover a more familiar tone between them. Emily, he said carefully, you never mentioned any of this. His hand gestured vaguely toward the SUVs, toward Daniel Hayes, toward the invisible jet waiting in the distance. The words carried a mixture of disbelief and something else he had not expected to feel tonight. Regret. Emily turned her eyes back to him. For a second the memory of the past flickered between them like a reflection across water. The long years when Jason Walker had been the center of every room. The long years when she had stood quietly beside him while he built the life he believed belonged only to him. Her voice when she answered was calm, almost gentle. There were many things you never asked about, Jason. The simple statement settled into the night air with surprising weight. Jason opened his mouth slightly as if searching for a reply, but the words refused to arrive. Behind Emily, the driver remained patiently beside the SUV while the soft interior light illuminated the open seat waiting inside. Daniel Hayes stepped forward just slightly then, not interrupting but offering a quiet reminder. The runway window will remain open for another 15 minutes, he said respectfully. After that we would need to request another departure slot from the tower. Emily nodded once, acknowledging the practical reality of the moment. She reached down and ran her fingers lightly along the roof of the Honda again, feeling the familiar warmth of metal that had carried her through countless quiet mornings and late-night drives when no one else had been watching. It had been a simple car, but it had been hers. Finally, she stepped away from it. The movement was small, but it seemed to shift the gravity of the entire parking lot. Jason watched her as if hoping she might turn back toward him, offer some explanation that would restore the simple story he had believed about her life. Instead, she walked calmly toward the waiting SUV. Daniel Hayes stepped aside slightly to give her space, the quiet respect of someone who understood that tonight was not about arrival or departure. It was about recognition. And as Emily Carter reached the open door beneath the soft glow of the parking lot lights, Jason Walker finally understood that the woman he thought he had left behind no longer existed. Emily Carter paused beside the open door of the SUV, the warm interior lights spilling softly onto the pavement while the distant runway lights blinked like quiet signals across the dark horizon. For a brief second, she looked back at the old silver Honda parked alone under the row of lamps, its paint slightly faded, its windshield catching the reflection of the hotel's glowing entrance. It had carried her through early mornings when the city was still quiet, and through late nights when the world felt heavier than it should. It had been there when everything else disappeared. Jason Walker watched her from several yards away, the confident posture he had worn all evening now replaced by a strange stillness. The small crowd around him remained silent, their attention moving between the billionaire waiting patiently and the woman who had arrived in the most ordinary car in the entire lot. Jason ran a hand across the back of his neck, trying to make sense of the shifting gravity of the moment. He had always believed he understood how the world worked. Status announced itself through expensive watches, new cars, exclusive invitations. The signals had always been obvious to him, but tonight the signals had been wrong. Emily turned slightly toward Daniel Hayes, her voice calm and steady. "Thank you for waiting, Daniel." He gave a small respectful nod, his tone warm but professional. "Of course. The crew has the engines warming and the flight plan is already filed. The weather window should remain clear for the next 2 hours." The quiet certainty in his voice carried the easy confidence of someone accustomed to speaking about aircraft the way others spoke about taxis. Jason took another step forward before he realized he had moved. His voice came out more uncertain than he intended. "Emily, hold on a second." She turned her head slightly, meeting his eyes again. The parking lot lights cast soft shadows across his face, revealing the confusion he had not been able to hide. He gestured again toward the distant runway, toward the convoy of black vehicles, toward the silent attention of everyone watching. "Since when did this become your life?" Emily studied him for a moment, not with anger, not even with triumph, but with a calm clarity that had taken years to build. "Since the moment I stopped trying to live the life you designed for me," she replied quietly. The words settled into the evening air with the simple weight of truth. Daniel Hayes remained silent, allowing the conversation to exist without interruption, but there was a faint respect in his expression now. He had seen many powerful people, but calm strength always impressed him more than noise. Jason looked back toward the old Honda again, then toward the SUV waiting beside Emily. The contrast between the two seemed almost impossible to reconcile, but the reality standing in front of him refused to change. Emily Carter was no longer the quiet woman who had once stood beside him in crowded rooms while he took the spotlight. She had rebuilt something entirely her own. Emily finally stepped forward and placed one hand lightly on the edge of the SUV door. The driver straightened slightly, ready to close it once she was seated. The night air carried the distant sound of jet engines rolling steadily along the runway. Jason opened his mouth again, as if there were still something left to say, some question that might untangle the moment. But before the words arrived, Emily Carter stepped calmly into the waiting vehicle, and the soft interior light framed the quiet certainty in her eyes as the door began to close. The soft thud of the SUV door closing sounded louder than it should have in the quiet parking lot, as if it marked the end of something Jason Walker had not realized was slipping away until it was already gone. Inside the vehicle, the interior lights cast a warm glow across the dark leather seats while Emily Carter settled calmly into the corner of the spacious cabin. The door sealed, with a gentle click, muting the sounds of the outside world into a distant hum. For a moment, she could still see Jason standing under the parking lot lamps through the tinted glass, his posture stiff, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and realization. Outside, Daniel Hayes remained beside the vehicle, his composed presence anchoring the moment with quiet authority. The driver stepped forward and moved toward the front seat, but Daniel lifted one hand slightly, signaling him to wait. Jason had taken another step closer to the SUV without even realizing it. The faint roar of jet engines carried through the warm evening air again, rolling across the city like a distant reminder that time did not pause for anyone's confusion. Jason spoke before he could stop himself. "Emily," he called out, his voice sharper now, edged with the urgency of someone who felt a conversation slipping away before it was finished. The name hung in the air for a second. Inside the SUV, Emily turned her head slightly toward the window, the dim parking lot lights reflecting faintly across the glass. Daniel Hayes glanced toward her through the open space beside the door frame, silently offering the choice of whether to continue the conversation or let the night end exactly where it stood. Emily took a slow breath. Then she reached forward and tapped lightly against the inside panel. The driver immediately stepped back and reopened the door. The cool night air flowed into the cabin again as Emily stepped out once more onto the pavement. The movement surprised nearly everyone watching. Jason blinked in confusion, clearly not expecting her to return even for a moment. Emily walked a few steps toward him, stopping halfway between the SUV and the old Honda that still sat quietly beneath the lights. For a second, neither of them spoke. The distance between them felt larger than the few yards of asphalt. Jason rubbed his hands together slowly, trying to recover the familiar rhythm of conversation he had always controlled. "You could have told me," he said finally, his voice lower now. "All of this. The jet. Him. The companies you are clearly connected to." Emily tilted her head slightly, studying his expression with calm patience. There was no bitterness in her voice when she answered, only clarity. "Jason, there was a time when I tried to tell you many things." The words were not sharp, yet they landed with quiet precision. Jason felt the memory flicker through his mind, whether he wanted it to or not. Long evenings years ago when Emily had spoken about ideas, about projects, about possibilities that had seemed too small for the world he was chasing. Back then he had been too busy building his own spotlight to notice what she was building beside him. Daniel Hayes watched the exchange silently, his expression thoughtful. He had spent enough years around powerful people to recognize moments of truth when they appeared. Emily glanced briefly toward the distant runway again, where the jet lights blinked patiently against the dark sky. Then she looked back at Jason one final time. "The difference now was simple," she said quietly. "I stopped waiting for someone else to see my value before I started building it." The words settled between them like the closing note of a long song. For the first time that night, Jason Walker had no response. And in the quiet that followed, the distant engines of the waiting aircraft seemed to grow just a little louder. The quiet that followed Emily Carter's words lingered in the warm night air, stretching across the parking lot like a calm tide that refused to retreat. Jason Walker stood motionless beneath the pale yellow glow of the overhead lights, his mind still turning through the last sentence she had spoken. "I stopped waiting for someone else to see my value before I started building it." The truth of it settled deeper the longer the silence lasted. Around them, the small crowd that had gathered earlier remained unusually still, the subtle curiosity of wealth and reputation keeping everyone rooted in place. Conversations inside the hotel continued behind the tall glass walls, the distant music drifting faintly through the evening air, but outside the world had narrowed to the quiet triangle formed by Emily, Jason, and Daniel Hayes. Daniel remained near the open SUV door with the patient composure of a man who understood timing better than most people understood conversation. He checked the sleek watch on his wrist once before lifting his eyes toward the distant runway lights blinking steadily in the darkness. The aircraft was ready. The crew would be waiting. Yet he did not interrupt. Emily stood calmly in the center of the lot, the soft breeze moving lightly through her hair while the reflections of the parking lot lamps shimmered across the polished surface of the SUVs. For the first time since arriving, Jason seemed uncertain where to place his attention. His eyes drifted from Emily to Daniel Hayes, and then toward the faint glow of the runway again, the pieces of the evening still refusing to fit together inside the story he had been telling himself for years. Finally he spoke again, though his voice had lost the easy confidence it carried earlier. "So that is it then," he said slowly. "You just disappear into this life, and that is the end of the conversation." Emily studied him quietly for a moment. There was no anger in her expression. If anything, there was a calm understanding that came from distance. "Jason," she said gently, "this conversation ended a long time ago. Tonight you just finally noticed." The words were not cruel, but they carried a quiet finality that made several of the onlookers shift slightly where they stood. Daniel Hayes allowed himself the smallest approving nod, not because the moment favored him, but because honesty always carried a certain dignity. Jason exhaled slowly and looked away toward the old Honda still parked alone beneath the lights. For a brief second, something almost nostalgic crossed his face. He remembered the early years before the companies and the contracts, when that same car had once been new and the future had seemed simple enough to hold in both hands. He let out a short breath that might have been a laugh or might have been regret. "I guess I never thought you would outgrow the version of life we started with," he admitted quietly. Emily followed his gaze to the silver Honda. Her hand rested lightly on the roof again for a second, a small gesture of gratitude rather than attachment. I did not outgrow it, she said softly. I built something beside it. The distant engines from the waiting jet rolled across the sky again, steady and patient. Daniel Hayes finally stepped forward just enough to gently reopen the SUV door, the interior lights spilling once more onto the pavement. Emily gave Jason one last calm look, the kind that carried neither resentment nor invitation. Then she turned and walked toward the vehicle again, the quiet certainty in her steps making it clear that whatever road had brought her here was only the beginning of somewhere else. Emily Carter stepped toward the open SUV again, the soft light from the cabin stretching across the pavement like a quiet invitation. The night air carried the distant hum of jet engines rolling steadily across the runway, a reminder that somewhere beyond the city lights a different journey was already waiting. Daniel Hayes stood beside the door with the composed patience of someone who understood that certain moments were not about schedules or aircraft or business agreements. Some moments were simply about closure. Emily paused once more before entering, her eyes drifting briefly across the parking lot. The silver Honda still sat beneath the row of lamps, its windshield catching reflections of the hotel's glowing entrance. For years that small car had been her quiet companion, carrying her through mornings when the future had felt uncertain and nights when the world seemed larger than her place in it. She allowed herself one small smile before turning back toward the waiting vehicle. Crowd had begun to thin, a few people drifting toward the hotel entrance while others remained just long enough to witness the ending they sensed was coming. Daniel Hayes stepped slightly closer to the SUV, resting one hand lightly on the door frame. The runway departure window will close in 10 minutes, he said respectfully, his voice soft enough that it sounded less like pressure and more like a quiet reminder of time moving forward. Emily nodded. Then she turned fully back toward the vehicle. Before stepping inside, she glanced once more toward the old Honda. It remained exactly where it had been when she arrived, a simple car beneath bright lights, the kind of vehicle most people would never notice twice. Yet tonight it had brought her to the one moment she needed. She placed a hand briefly on the edge of the SUV door and looked back at Jason one final time. Take care of yourself, Jason, she said calmly. There was no bitterness in the words, only a quiet farewell. Then she stepped into the SUV and settled into the seat as the door closed with a soft, final sound. Outside, Daniel Hayes gave a small nod to the driver. The engine started smoothly, the vehicle rolling forward beneath the glowing lights of the hotel. And as the convoy moved slowly toward the road leading to the runway, Jason Walker remained standing beside the silver Honda, finally understanding that the woman he once laughed at had simply been traveling a different runway all along. The black SUV rolled slowly through the hotel driveway, its headlights sweeping across polished marble pillars and tall glass windows where the gala continued in elegant ignorance. Inside the vehicle, Emily Carter sat quietly against the soft leather seat, the gentle hum of the engine replacing the noise of the parking lot she had just left behind. Through the tinted window, she could still see the silver Honda parked beneath the row of lights, smaller now as the distance grew with every passing second. For a brief moment her reflection merged with the passing city lights, and she allowed herself a quiet breath that carried both relief and something deeper. Closure. Daniel Hayes sat across from her in the opposite seat, his posture relaxed but attentive, giving her the quiet space that thoughtful people understood how to offer. Outside the window the city moved in smooth lines of light and shadow while the convoy turned onto the private access road that led toward the executive runway. The distant aircraft lights grew brighter with every passing yard. After a moment Daniel spoke gently, his voice calm and respectful. You handled that with remarkable grace. Many people would have said much more. Emily looked out at the blinking runway lights before answering. Sometimes silence says exactly what needs to be said. Daniel gave a small nod, the faintest smile appearing as he leaned back slightly. That is a skill many powerful people never learn. The SUV continued down the long service road, the faint roar of the jet engines now louder as the aircraft waited patiently on the illuminated strip of pavement ahead. Inside the cabin the quiet felt different than before. Not heavy, not uncertain, simply peaceful. Emily folded her hands loosely in her lap, and allowed her thoughts to drift back through the years that had led her here. There had been no dramatic turning point, no sudden miracle, just small choices repeated every day. Learning, building, refusing to shrink herself to fit inside someone else's idea of success. Outside the windshield, the jet came fully into view now, its polished body reflecting the bright runway lights like a mirror of the night sky. The flight crew stood near the aircraft stairs waiting with the calm efficiency of professionals accustomed to unusual arrivals. Daniel glanced toward the runway before returning his attention to Emily. The board meeting in Seattle will begin in the morning, but the investors are eager to hear your proposal. I believe tonight's timing may actually work in your favor. Emily allowed herself a quiet smile. For years, Jason had believed she was simply the quiet partner who stayed in the background. He had never realized that she had been studying markets while he chased applause. Daniel Hayes had noticed. The investors had noticed. Eventually, the world had noticed. The SUV slowed as it approached the edge of the runway where another vehicle waited beside the aircraft stairs. The driver eased to a stop and stepped out to open the door. Cool night air filled the cabin again as the distant sound of jet engines vibrated through the ground beneath their feet. Emily stepped out onto the pavement, the wind from the idling engines lifting her hair slightly as she looked up at the sleek aircraft ready for departure. For a brief second, she thought about the parking lot again, about the laughter, about the silver Honda that had carried her quietly through years of rebuilding. And then she turned toward the waiting jet with calm certainty, knowing that the life she had built was not about proving anyone wrong. It was simply about continuing forward. The wind from the idling engines swept across the runway in steady waves, carrying the sharp scent of fuel and cool night air as Emily Carter stepped closer to the sleek aircraft waiting beneath the bright runway lights. The jet looked even larger up close, its polished body reflecting the glow of the tarmac like a mirror capturing the entire night sky. The small set of stairs extended from the open cabin door, and a member of the flight crew stood at the top with the calm professionalism of someone accustomed to quiet departures and powerful passengers. Emily paused at the base of the stairs for a moment, looking up at the aircraft not with excitement, but with quiet reflection. For years she had imagined success as something loud, something dramatic, something that would arrive like a sudden spotlight. Instead, it had arrived slowly, piece by piece, through patience and persistence, and the simple refusal to stop moving forward. Daniel Hayes stepped beside her, the wind tugging lightly at the edge of his coat while he followed her gaze toward the jet. "She is ready whenever you are," he said in a steady voice that carried easily over the distant hum of the engines. Emily nodded gently. "Thank you for arranging everything so quickly." Daniel gave a small, thoughtful smile. It was not difficult. When people believe in the direction you are going, they usually find a way to help you get there. The simple statement carried a quiet truth that Emily had learned many times during the past few years. Opportunities rarely appeared for people who waited for permission. They appeared for people who prepared for them long before anyone else noticed. Emily placed one hand lightly on the rail of the aircraft stairs and began to climb. Each step carried her a little higher above the glowing runway lights until the city skyline stretched out behind her in soft shadows. At the top of the stairs, she turned once more, looking back. Across the wide stretch of runway where the SUVs now waited near the edge of the tarmac. Somewhere beyond the airport lights, the hotel parking lot still existed, and somewhere in that lot the silver Honda remained parked beneath the lamps. The thought did not bring sadness. Instead, it brought a quiet gratitude. Every road had led here. Inside the aircraft cabin, soft lighting illuminated a spacious interior designed for long flights and important conversations. A wide table stood near the center with documents already arranged neatly across its surface. Laptops waited beside glasses of water, while soft leather seats faced the large oval windows that looked out across the runway. Emily stepped inside and took in the calm atmosphere of the aircraft. The world outside continued to move at its usual pace, but here the air felt focused and purposeful. Daniel entered a moment later and nodded to the pilot visible through the open cockpit door. "We are ready when the tower clears us," the pilot replied with quiet confidence. Emily moved toward the window seat and looked out across the runway lights one last time before sitting down. The engines grew louder as the crew prepared for departure, the aircraft vibrating gently beneath her feet. Daniel took the seat across from her and opened the folder of documents waiting on the table. "Seattle is expecting us by morning," he said. "And after tonight, I suspect your presentation will carry even more weight." Emily smiled faintly and looked out at the long runway stretching into the darkness ahead. For years she had been told that her role was to stand quietly behind someone else's ambition. Tonight she had stepped onto a different runway entirely. And as the jet began to roll slowly forward beneath the bright runway lights, Emily Carter knew that the life she was building was only beginning to gather speed. The aircraft gathered speed along the illuminated runway, the vibration beneath Emily Carter's seat growing stronger as the engines pushed the sleek jet forward through the cool night air. Outside the oval window, the lines of runway lights stretched into long golden trails while the city skyline slowly began to fall behind them. Inside the cabin, everything remained calm and controlled, the quiet professionalism of the crew blending with the steady hum of the engines. Emily rested one hand lightly against the window frame as she watched the final edge of the runway approach. For a brief moment, the ground seemed to hold its breath. Then the aircraft lifted smoothly into the night sky, the wheels leaving the pavement with a gentle shift that felt less like departure and more like release. The lights of the city spread out beneath them in quiet patterns while the aircraft climbed steadily into the dark horizon. Daniel Hayes closed the folder of documents on the table and leaned back slightly, allowing the engines to settle into their steady, cruising rhythm. "Congratulations," he said quietly. "Most people never reach the moment where they realize they have truly changed their own direction." Emily looked out across the scattered lights of the city far below. For years, she had measured success by the way others reacted to it. The applause, the approval, the recognition. Tonight she understood something different. The real turning point had happened long before the jet ever touched the runway. It had happened the moment she stopped asking whether she deserved more and started building something that proved she did. The aircraft continued climbing until the clouds below looked like soft silver fields beneath the moonlight. Daniel poured a glass of water and placed it gently on the table near her seat. "The investors in Seattle have been reviewing your proposal all week," he said. "Several of them believe the new aerospace logistics platform could reshape regional cargo transport within 5 years." Emily smiled faintly, her mind already shifting from the past to the future. She had spent years studying the patterns of global supply routes, while others assumed she was simply watching from the sidelines. Now those years of quiet preparation were beginning to connect into something larger. Daniel studied her expression for a moment. "You know," he added thoughtfully, "when I first heard your presentation 6 months ago, I realized something immediately." Emily turned slightly toward him. "What was that?" Daniel rested his hands calmly on the table. "You were never trying to prove anyone wrong. You were simply building something too important to ignore." The aircraft leveled out at cruising altitude, and the cabin lights softened slightly as the city disappeared into the distance behind them. Emily looked out across the dark horizon ahead. Somewhere thousands of feet below, the parking lot outside the Grand Meridian Hotel had returned to its normal rhythm. The gala continued. Conversations moved on. But one moment had already changed the direction of several lives. Jason Walker might spend years replaying that night in his mind, wondering when the story had shifted beyond his control. Emily Carter did not feel the need to look back again. She rested comfortably in her seat while the jet carried her west through the quiet night sky, the future unfolding mile by mile ahead of them.